Thank you all for coming along. So we have 2 more talks in April. And my mind, if you can see my mind working, I'm trying to think about which days those are. It's not the first week back from spring break, but it's the one that follows. April 12th and April 27th. Yeah. So thank you to some of the mainstays in the seminar series this semester. I think this has been fantastic. Jack is our finale just before spring break 2017. So Jack Stilgoe, many of you already may know Jack. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. He's been with us for this sabbatical year, spending the time in Boulder and touring the Western United States with his lovely family. He works broadly on science and technology policy, particularly in the area of governance of science and emerging technologies and public engagement with science. And so it's a real privilege and a great opportunity for us to be able to sit with Jack and be in conversation over these last months and months that are to come. Previously a senior fellow at Exeter University, working on responsible innovation at that time. I'm just looking at you to correct me if any of this is inaccurate.
Only if it downplays my achievements. If you exaggerate them, then I won't correct you.
He's worked at a think tank, Demos, in the past, and has worked also with the Royal Society in London. He's part of a group that continues to run the Guardian political science blog. He's an avid poison dart frog collector.
I'll run with that.
Okay. In addition, he's on the editorial board of Public Understanding of Science, a member of the Science Wise Steering Group, advising the UK government on public engagement with science, and a member of the Research Council's UK Public Engagement and Research Advisory panel. So that is a little bit of a long-winded introduction, and then the floor is yours. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Max.
Wait, can I ask a question about that introduction? How old are you? Like, how did you get on all these things? Like, you look quite young.
Don't ask me open day. All right, Jack.
I daren't ask you, Daniel, how old you might think I am.
Oh, man.
I'm older than I look.
I'm never to ask that.
Except if I look old. I'm almost 40.
Holy crap.
Yeah. So thank you, and thanks Max for the introduction, and thank you also for hosting me for what has been a joyous and fascinating, what is it now, 8 months or so. And this is really an opportunity to just work through some early thinking that I've been doing on emerging technology governance applied to a new case for me. And just to give you a bit of background, so much of my previous emerging technologies work was on geoengineering, which is sort of infuriatingly immaterial as a debate to engage with, because the more you study the sorts of things that are being said and researched on geoengineering, the more you realise that it's a little bit like trying to clutch at clouds. So there's not really, you know, the technological imaginaries are thoroughly speculative, and there isn't actually a huge amount of science being done in that space. And so for somebody studying scientists and innovators, there's a sense that maybe people like me have become part of the problem. So I wanted to get into something that was a bit more material, and where the scale of investment was enough to justify the need for a real critical analysis, and that's why I turned to self-driving cars. And this actually comes out of some work that I've been doing with UCL colleagues in London for the Department for Transport in Britain, who wanted to know, as governments around the world do want to know, what should we do about self-driving cars, in effect. And so we did a bit of stakeholder work for them, sort of injecting a bit of British grumpiness into a debate that has been extremely overexcited and, dare I say it in the present company, a little bit American. And so some of my thinking on this comes from that sort of place. But I also want to use this as an opportunity to develop some thinking I've been doing on what has been called responsible innovation, which is a new name for a set of familiar debates to do with how we govern emerging technologies in the public interest. And in particular, I'm interested in reframing that with as a question of learning, how it is that we as policymakers, as societies, can get better at learning from case to case. And the learning terminology becomes particularly interesting, I think, around self-driving cars because they are a test case, if you like, for extremely rapid developments in machine learning. So in this talk, I'm just going to think through social learning and machine learning, consider the ways in which self-driving has been interpreted as what we might call a solvable problem, and how that takes us into a particular mode of governance, and then consider what I call the limits to responsiveness. So what might be the things that will steer de facto self-driving innovation in a particular direction, and what we might do to resist that, and what the role for governments might be. So my object, and as I said, when it came to geoengineering, I didn't have objects that I was able to put pictures up of. It was all just sort of, schemes and experimental apparatus and all the rest of it. Here I have an object. You might not quite be able to see, but this is a truck carrying 6 cars along I-80 in southern Wyoming. So this is a photo that I took on an extremely lonely drive back from California to here. I don't expect any of you to have recognized I-80 in southern Wyoming, but there it is. These cars I thought were particularly interesting because they are the new Model S made by Tesla. That is the car that, according to Tesla, has, and I quote, full self-driving hardware. So this is a car that, according to its manufacturers, has the potential, if not the ability, to drive itself. And according to the chief executive of Tesla, Elon Musk, it should be able to do so by the end of this year from one coast to the other. However, this is not yet a self-driving car. The interesting thing about this object is that while the claim is that the body is all in place, the brain still needs to be developed. This is a car that in some way still needs to learn how to behave in public. And we, society, need to learn how to understand, accommodate, shape, steer such things. So it would seem to be an interesting conversation piece. The Tesla Model S, in its slightly less sophisticated incarnation, is also was also famously implicated in what we might call the world's first self-driving car fatality back in May, when an enthusiast for Tesla, a guy called Joshua Brown, died behind the wheel of a Tesla Model S that was in autopilot mode, which we might understand in some ways being a type of self-driving technology, although the accuracy of that claim is one of the things that's under discussion here. This was from the early crash report of that incident, and the Tesla drove into a truck that was crossing its path. The technology that was supposed to distinguish the truck from the sky behind failed to do so, so the car went at about 75 miles an hour into the side of this truck, underneath its trailer, spun off the road, killing the driver. Now, I say this not to be morbid, but we people in STS do like a good accident, because accidents, the argument goes, are an opportunity to see technological reality rather than technological performance, to see what happens when technologies to see when technologies malfunction, what might you learn about technologies functioning. Now this crash, actually, even though it happened in May, only came to light in July when Tesla admitted in a blog post that this had happened and that there was an investigation underway. And the claims for people in STS that study accidents, they're a fairly typical sort of set of claims there, which is that the circumstances of this accident were exceptional, that things happen in the real world that can't be accounted for in engineers' models. But unlike a nuclear power plant or other things that people have studied in terms of accidents, there was an admission that this technology was, according to the blog post, still in a public beta phase. So it was in effect an experimental technology, and the users of this technology should have been aware of the experimentality of that. And again, within STS, there's a fairly common mode of criticism and analysis of emerging technologies as forms of social experiment, as a way to get under the skin of technology. Here's this is actually a poster from a film produced in France, which takes a critical eye on two technologies, being nuclear power and genetically modified crops, which you probably know are the sorts of things that we Europeans worry about in ways that in the States tends not to be the case. And this poster is asking, in fact, are we all guinea pigs? Right, that's the claim, and you will all be familiar with those sorts of claims that are made about technologies. Right? People, they might refer to themselves as willing guinea pigs, and we'll come to some of that with in the case of the Tesla. But more often, it's an expression of powerlessness, an expression that that technologies are in some way experiments on unsuspecting users. And within science policy, this has a fairly long history. So the top quote there, let me just run you through it. So this is Alvin Weinberg claiming that, in effect, nuclear power plants, Alvin Weinberg, let's not forget, was a huge fan of nuclear power plants, but claiming that actually they will always be somewhat experimental. That you will never be able to claim with certainty that a nuclear power plant is safe, simply because there aren't enough of them to do the experiment on. And this type of analysis took a more critical turn with STS, and that's Krohn and Weingart there saying that, Wolfgang Krohn and Peter Weingart saying that that's why we should study accidents, because those are the moments when we understand the uncertainties of those technologies, rather than pretending that perfect safety can ever exist. And the bottom insight that I've got there from Brian Wynne, who's been a friend and collaborator of mine going back a few years, is that technologies, rather than pretending that they are responses or fit into a regulatory landscape and just follow rules, technological practices themselves create rules. They are rule-making as well as rule-following behavior, which becomes interesting when we consider machine learning. So, responsible innovation then is an approach to dealing with the experimentality of new technologies. The sorts of cases that people like me get interested in and have applied our thinking to include, the top left there is a trial of genetically modified crops in Britain. At the time, it was the only plot of genetically modified crops in Britain being grown behind two 10-foot-high fences with a guard dog in the middle, which tells you something about where we've got to with the state of genetically modified crops in Britain. It's a hugely controversial thing. We've got some carbon nanotubes on the top right. Nanotechnology became the next test case. Synthetic biology came along next, and geoengineering followed that. And sort of wave upon wave of emerging technology, where in the minds of policymakers the concern was that we don't make the same mistakes that we made with genetically modified crops, which were seen to have ended up in the wrong place, i.e. with public rejection rather than public acceptance. And the sorts of questions that are raised by these technologies relate not just to the technological products, who benefits, who is put at risk, what are the risks, how might we mitigate them, which is the sort of conventional mode of technology governance, but also to innovation processes, and to make it more political, the question of innovation purposes. What direction do we feel that innovation is going? So if we wanted to reinterpret the genetically modified crops example, we might say that wasn't just a debate about are these things safe or not. That was also a debate about who benefits from this. What is the political economy of patenting particular genomic sequences, tying up that patent in a seed, and ensuring that that seed has monopoly control, right? Which has become a familiar critique of genetically modified crops. So responsible innovation is offered as a way to constructively engage with the uncertainties of emerging technologies. I and colleagues have defined it in intentionally broad terms, so broad it may even be vacuous, but in order to capture as wide a range of concerns as possible, as about being caring for the future through the present-day stewardship of innovation, and attending to a few characteristics. So making innovation more anticipatory, more inclusive, more reflexive, but crucially also more responsive. So considering the ways in which we might reply to public scrutiny of emerging technologies and also change direction in the face of those things. Right? There's a sense that certainly in Europe we've got very good now at having public discussions about emerging technologies, but we're still very bad at making the connection to questions of governance. What do we do about that in the light of those concerns? So taking those things forward to machine learning then, actually just before I do, let me just flick back to the bottom point of that one, which is the point that Steve Rayner, who's a colleague that some of us know in Oxford, has made the point that the presumption of novelty in cases of emerging technologies actually acts against social learning. We pretend that each new technology comes along with its own set of concerns, its own set of ethical dilemmas, and we engage with those. And actually, a lot of the time, the questions raised by emerging technologies can be traced across all of them, and they are fairly generic questions, as I put up before. So let's take this into machine learning then. Machine learning, which has already attracted a huge amount of attention from, if you like, the usual suspects of technology governance, which is people like me in science and technology studies, science and technology policy, but also in law, ethics, asking questions about new dilemmas, new existential concerns. I've put up here two examples that have attracted attention because they would seem to present some of the immediate questions that machine learning introduces into society. The first one, I guess, it attracted a lot of attention when a London company called DeepMind, who had just been bought up by Google, managed to create a deep learning system that started beating human Go champions. And Go was always seen as a game that was too complicated for computers to learn, unlike chess, which the computers beat us at many years ago. And this sort of set off a set of concerns to do with general artificial intelligence and you will have all seen some of the sort of new masters of the universe arguing about the potential for general artificial intelligence to present an existential risk to human beings, which I regard as a non-issue. Right? I just don't think it's interesting. I think it's extremely convenient for artificial intelligence researchers to look at, but I don't really care. Until such time as I am made extinct by said artificial intelligence, in which case I will start caring. The bottom left example, I think, is the sort of thing that we could be more concerned about, which was, in this case, a controversy that arose because Google had started using machine learning in the categorization of photographs, starting off in a sort of experimental mode, but then saying this is a tool that you can use, and controversially started making some mistakes, including in this example, mischaracterizing photos of black Americans as gorillas, with clear political outrage generated because of that. And the particular interesting additional concern that came from that was when Google started asking, well, how did this happen? It turned out that they didn't really know, nor were they really able to easily find out how this mistake arose within their algorithms, because these were systems that taught themselves rules rather than were taught rules by human beings. And so while we could evaluate them in terms of the outcomes, it was extremely hard to evaluate them in terms of processes, which becomes important when we get to self-driving cars. So, self-driving cars then. What's new? So somebody like me, I'm interested in studying societal expectations around emerging technologies as much as anything, which means that I quite like looking at things like past visions of the future and current imaginations of the future, and no, this is a little bit unfair what I'm about to do, but I'm going to do it nevertheless. Which is so this is an organisation called Gartner, who produce a hype cycle every year, looking at emerging technologies and saying where are they, how much are they being hyped, when are we likely to see them in reality. In 2015, you'll see that autonomous vehicles are right up here. So they're right at the very peak of inflated expectations. And if you follow the key down, it says that they're 5 to 10 years away. We will problematise what that means for them to be 5 to 10 years away, especially as I have already told you that there are self-driving cars in the world and that people have already died at the wheels of them. Or sorry, one person we know has died. The next year, autonomous vehicles are starting to ride down what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment. And amusingly, where last year they were 5 to 10 years away, 2 years ago they were 5 to 10 years away, last year they were more than 10 years away. Okay, so you see the pattern here. If every year they become 5 more years away, in 10 years' time, they'll be 60 years away. So we can have a bit of fun with that. But there is something, go back to the history of autonomous vehicles and say, actually, they're one of these technologies that, like nuclear fusion, has always been on the horizon. So what is it about now that would account for our excitement? So this is Chris Urmson, actually doing quite a nice STS job in terms of this. Chris Urmson, who was one of the leads at Google for the self-driving car project there. And he says, maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 30 years, and I'm here to tell you that honestly it's a bit of both. So, and actually it's quite a sophisticated sort of analysis, which is to say that the future, as William Gibson liked to say, is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Right? So the question is not when a technology will arrive, but for whom and in what way will a technology be said to exist and be said to be nearby. But suffice it to say that a lot of people now think that this is a technology that is not just possible, but is in some way inevitable. But we still have to hold on to the question of what the it is. Right? What does a self-driving car? What will it look like? What are the contingencies in that space? So let's look at how some people almost as or pollution or congestion or public space or the public realm or however. So there's an elision between the engineering challenge and the social challenge of self-driving. To which we might ask, well, if self-driving cars are being presented as they are as the solution to some of these big social challenges, the dominant one being safety, then what might the alternatives be? So this graph here, and again, sorry, this will come across a little bit like a sort of, this is European exceptionalism, if you like, but it should be noted that America is one of the most dangerous places to be in a car in the world, in the developed world, right? And that if America was particularly concerned about the question of road safety, it probably would have done something about it before now. Here you see that the death rates per 100,000 population in the States are about 5 times what they are in Sweden, and per mile travelled they are about 3 times what they are in Britain and Sweden. And actually in the last few years they've got worse because of, well, according to some explanations, because of increasingly distracted driving, because of people texting. So if safety is the question, then are self-driving cars the answer? Well, probably not. There's other things that one could do that would be cheaper and more effective and quicker, and we know the outcomes, and they could just be done. Nevertheless, self-driving cars are being offered as a solution to this problem. And they are being offered as a solution to this problem, not just a way of tackling this problem. You know, people talk about, for example, the death of the insurance industry because there will be no more accidents. Imagining a world that is fully self-driving, not a world that is transitioning towards self-driving. So, in my work, I guess one of the things I'm trying to do is reframe this as a project to consider not just the end point, the end goal, and the imagination of particular problems and particular solutions, but to look at the question of how we might get there. And see this as a challenge of social learning. So I'm interested in, for example, how companies present how they learn certain things. I'm just going to turn, for some reason this video has the theme tune to Benny Hill as its background. And again, it's a source of some bemusement to British people that Benny Hill still has any form of recognition in this country because he was abandoned by his homeland pretty much the year after he stopped working on television because he's awful. Here, however, is a demonstration video of Tesla, and all self-driving companies would offer similar sorts of things, showing, if you like, their system performing here in difficult conditions, right, difficult weather conditions, on difficult roads, insisting at the start that the driver has to be there for legal reasons, but that he in effect needn't be there, and showing you on the right-hand side what the car is seeing, and crucially how the car is interpreting the world. So how it's categorizing objects into infrastructural information, other moving objects that might be regarded as friends or foes, you know, things that might threaten the technology, the movement of the car, and categorizing all of these things, interpreting them, and basically it's a performance of perfection. But as roboticists themselves have pointed out, such things are, and this is a nice phrase, I'll just quote it, such demonstrations are always doomed to succeed, right? They tell you nothing, because a self-driving car company can claim that, for example, as they already have, that a car can drive 99% of a journey in self-driving mode. And still regulators might legitimately be interested in that 1%, or that 0.1%, or the 0.01% when accidents might happen. And we've already seen with Tesla that accidents do happen, and that claims to the experimentality of that technology are not a sufficient explanation. We can look at not just accidents as opportunities, a crack through which to see into the world of technology, but we can also look at controversy. So what happens when different companies disagree about the trajectory of the technology? What does that tell you? Well, one of the things that happened after the Tesla crash is that Tesla said goodbye to its previous provider of sensors, who were called Mobileye, an Israeli company, and they got into bed with NVIDIA, the company that I mentioned before. And Mobileye were interestingly critical of Tesla's hubris in using their technology. They in effect said that Tesla had misunderstood the contingencies of this technology, proceeded as though it was perfect, and that was a mistake. And for example, the technology is still incapable of dealing with the situation that happened in the Tesla crash, because here was a car that was coming across the road that wasn't in the next door lane or in front of or behind, which is how these systems are designed. When a car comes or a truck comes across the road, the system is not trained to react to that. It hasn't learned how to deal with that. And for example, Tesla have insisted that they don't need any more sophisticated sensors than they've already got, while most of the other companies are using what's called LiDAR. And some of you may have seen on self-driving cars the thing that looks like an old-fashioned policeman's helmet spinning round. The Tesla doesn't have that. It uses radar, it uses visual cameras, and it uses ultrasound only. And NVIDIA claim that that's fine, because actually they claim that those sensors are up to the job, and that the task is not one of hardware, it's one of software. So we see a sort of a splitting apart of different modes of automotive learning. In machine learning terms, the distinction is between, on if you like, a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Which is not to say that some companies adopt one and other companies adopt the other, but that they have different balances of the two. And in the first, we have a system which, and this is going to be a caricature for anybody who knows machine learning, but in which we humans need to teach the algorithms the rules of the world. And in the other, a deep learning system in which we give the machine the data and the machine works out the rules. So the aim of the game is to find out the rules, if you like. And that takes you not just to some different engineering positions, but also some different political, economic positions. So some different attitudes to innovation, for example. Whether we see innovation as likely to come from incumbents or likely to come from the upstarts, people like Tesla, but also the variety of other largely US companies who claim to be developing off-the-shelf self-driving hardware, which relatively cheaply will be able to turn your car into a self-driving car. We also see some different histories. So in one mode of automotive learning where we prioritize things like domain expertise and the experience that the car industry has built up over 100+ years, they might talk about their histories of things like automated highways, which until recently were a part of the story, that it didn't make sense to talk about the car as itself a smart thing. The smart highway was the other side of the conversation. And apparently if you go to San Diego, there's still a stretch of highway in San Diego that still has magnets in it from the experiments that they were doing back in the 90s to develop smart highways. Now you see artificial intelligence presented as the solution to the problem of self-driving regardless of infrastructure. So seeing infrastructure as a static thing and saying we can do this regardless of infrastructure. To the extent where even the Cato Institute brought out a report the other day where they were saying that self-driving cars are so capable that actually we don't need to upgrade our infrastructure at all. So this was an argument against upgrading infrastructure from the political right. So and one of the things that I'll come to just at the end is that we can know from history that that's unlikely to be the case, that these things will make demands upon infrastructure. It's just a question of who benefits. On the deep learning side, the other school of thought in self-driving cars would historically have a shorter history and point to the rapid developments that happened around the DARPA Grand Challenges, where DARPA funded a prize for the creation of self-driving vehicles. And what you saw there was rapid step changes in performance. However, according to some engineers, that took us down a rather unproductive path because DARPA's interests were in a vehicle that could perform in an unpredictable, open environment, probably one without roads, whereas now we are thinking about self-driving cars in a context where we have relatively predictable infrastructures. So let me just think about another means of control. So again, self-driving cars imagined as largely a problem of machine control, how to develop control systems that take in data, make good probabilistic decisions based upon that data. And the history of automation suggests that, the history of automobiles, and indeed the history of aeroplanes as well, suggests that social control is just as important. This is actually a poster from an early campaign when it was realized that cars were starting to interact in large numbers with pedestrians on the streets, and that the safety problem was going to be sorted out only if pedestrians were taken off the streets. The initial impetus was to create a new misdemeanor, and this new misdemeanor was the invention of jaywalking. is the historian Peter Norton, I hope I've got his name right, did a nice history of, if you like, means of social control around the early introduction of the car. How it was that in order to make people safe, what we had to do was get them off the streets. We had to, in effect, restrict their freedoms. Now, in parts of Northern Europe, in some streets in London, there's actually a move to reintroduce pedestrians and cyclists and cars into the same shared space, as it's called, the shared space philosophy. But we can see that in realizing the potential of these new technologies, and self-driving cars would seem to have enormous potential, but we can see various possibilities for social control. At the same time, we have interesting dynamics of alternative learning happening around, and these are all around the Tesla, that are hard for the company to acknowledge and to come to terms with. So bottom left here, this woman is one of many videos of a Tesla user driving hands-free along a highway. The embarrassing thing is that she happens to be Elon Musk's wife. Up there, the top in the middle, we have a guy who's asleep while his car is driving in traffic. We have various YouTube videos of people testing how well the Tesla Model S responds to certain circumstances and claiming to discover bugs. So a lot of this is framed in software language. And bottom right is actually a so-called Easter egg in the car itself, where, should you wish, you can turn your the visual display into the Rainbow Road from the game Super Mario Kart. Which tells you something about the sort of playfulness of the invention, but also about the playfulness of people's experimentation with the technology. This was my favourite hack, actually, which is a guy who got annoyed with a twist that Tesla introduced. So after the crash, Tesla said that they were going to make it harder for people to use autopilot hands-free, so that you had to keep touching the steering wheel every now and then, otherwise the thing would shut you out of the system and you'd have to drive normally. So this guy said, okay, I'm going to try and find a way around that. He rigged up a system using elastic bands where he can, in effect, drive hands-free on autopilot for as long as he likes, and to resist what he calls the autopilot nanny feature. Right, so there's some interesting forms of experimentation going along. Tesla claimed to be an extremely responsive company, that they have an engaged community of largely expert users, a lot of whom are themselves scientists and engineers. But they must negotiate that responsiveness pretty carefully, because a lot of this would easily be regarded as irresponsible. They are also running they're treading a fine line, because the investigation of that crash said that, if you like, the fault was entirely with the driver for failing to understand the contingencies of the technology, that it was more uncertain than the driver had thought, and that autopilot was not a self-driving technology. It never claimed to be, nor was it a hands-free technology, even though Elon Musk, his wife, and various others are all using the technology hands-free. Nevertheless, it's extremely convenient for the company to blame human error for all of these things and to ignore the realities of technological use. So this is the head of autopilot saying, yes, we need to engage with what he calls human complacency, but this did not have implications for the design of the systems themselves. And again, for people in ergonomics, for people that look at airline accidents, this pattern is an extremely common one. Not just companies and engineers blaming human error, but also in lots of cases, humans themselves blaming human error. So this is another crash, another Tesla Model S crash, non-fatal, where the guy, bafflingly really, having stepped out of this crash, says, yeah, my fault. The technology, they could be a bit clearer about what this technology does and doesn't do, but yeah, it's, in effect, this guy accepted liability for it. Now, I think there's an interesting question about what's going on behind the scenes in terms of whether there are things being settled out of court. But again, this is a fairly familiar pattern of users blaming themselves for accidents, even though technological contingency is a factor, which is why, in the case of aeroplanes, ergonomicists have started talking about system-induced error rather than human error, right? Recognizing that people respond to engineering. So let me just wrap up. I don't want to do that. So the Elon Musk's framing and all of this is, it's simply a matter of doing the maths, Elon. You just need to add up the number of people whose lives will be saved by self-driving cars, and add up the number of people who are getting killed by conventional cars, and see which one looks best. And it's quite clear which one would look best. Needless to say, I mean, he may have a point, but this is only part of the risk conversation. So in STS and in risk analysis, we are interested in questions to do with the quality of risk as well as the quantity, which is why, for example, when an aeroplane crashes, we don't think that it's sufficient just to say, oh, well, fewer people die in aeroplane crashes than in car crashes, therefore let's move on, right? We take those things extremely seriously, and we investigate their causes, and we work out how things could be done better. I'm going to, I think, end there. Hopefully it's clear that I disagree with Elon Musk and that I'm not a fan of the Tesla, except that having driven one, I am really a fan of it. The only final point I would like to make, just going back to this question of social learning, sorry, nobody can see this now, is that while the fixation on the governance discussion tends to be with the object itself, with the self-driving car and the user, we would be kidding ourselves. And so we have these discussions, for example, framed as trolley problems. Ethicists will love this, and it's like a full employment act for ethicists. The trolley problems around self-driving cars. Should a self-driving car choose to kill a granny or a dog? Should it choose to kill a bus queue or drive itself off a cliff? Right? These sorts of things. Again, I think those are missing the point, because the governance discussion is so much bigger once we start imagining the genuine social experiment that these things will be a part of. And so considerations of, for example, how they will mix with other road users, how they will lead to the reshaping of landscapes, how they will place demands upon infrastructure. So I think making the demands to make machine-readable infrastructure, I think, will be one of the most interesting political economic considerations in this debate. Questions about how we enforce or encourage data sharing within these machines, I think, will all be far more important than trolley problems. So this is, if you like, an attempt to blow open the governance discussion. I've gone on too long, apologies, but thank you.
So really interesting talk, so thank you. Just two comments. One, or maybe a question, what do you think about kind of two dimensions? One is hype around self-driving cars versus reality.
Yeah.
So you brought up Elon Musk, and embedded in some of that discussion is this idea that the technology is hyped what it can actually do versus reality.
Yep.
And then related to that point is marketing versus reality.
Yeah.
So Tesla's trying to have it both ways by naming something autopilot it's kind of a wink and a nod to the public, like this is a self-driving car.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, they have all this legalese and all these disclaimers. This is not a self-driving car.
Yeah.
Except it kind of is, but it's definitely not.
Yeah.
So, so that's one. So I think that's interesting. There's kind of two channels of communication.
Absolutely.
And then the kind of comment is, I'm actually working with the Colorado Department of Transit, and they actually are interested in smart highways as an infrastructure improvement for self-driving cars, particularly to solve the snow problem, which is one of them.
Yeah.
So, maybe doing something like putting sensors in the road to indicate where the road boundaries are in the event that it gets covered in snow and the sensors can't detect it.
Yeah.
So you're quite right that, even though everyone says, oh, the car can do it all, people thinking about the infrastructure are actually really thinking about changing the infrastructure for the highway.
Yeah. And if you talk to policymakers, certainly in London, where we don't have the same extreme weather problems, but they know that they will be forced to upgrade their infrastructure in various ways. So let me take them on. So I think on the smart highways point, I think that it's just about a bit less hubris in saying that obviously this will need to happen. Right? Obviously, our current systems of infrastructure are designed for human conception and human control. We can't pretend that this is just like a game of chess where a technology will come along, learn from humans, be able to do everything well and then better and then claim mastery, and therefore that's the route to innovation. Right? That's just not a sensible story. So I think the sooner we get real about those sorts of demands, the better. The question of the name autopilot became a material concern in this debate because the German government and subsequently the Californians said, stop calling it autopilot. Right? You're fooling people. And I think maybe this is me being oversensitive about Donald Trump, but I think we are recognizing that these claims, even if they're just claims, have weight. Right? You can't just get away with saying, no, it's just a name. Right? What's in a name? Because it's clear that people are behaving in certain ways, and if we took ergonomics a little bit more seriously, we might take serious issue with that. And other companies as well. So Volvo, who in some countries actually call their system autopilot, but have been emphasizing that actually in most countries they call it pilot assist. That this is not a self-driving car technology, and that they're underclaiming rather than overclaiming. And then I think, so to take your first point about hype and reality, to say that things are hyped, I think is relatively uninteresting. I'm interested in studying the nature of that hype, and certainly in the subfield of science and technology studies that's called sociology of expectations, the sorts of questions that we would ask would be things like, recognizing that hype is a performance rather than a prediction. Right? It's salesmanship. The question is, who gets to define that hype? Who is shaping the future? And it becomes a question of power. I think actually there are aspects of the self-driving car debate that deserve to be hyped, to do with the potential for upgrading public transport, for example, that currently aren't getting hyped because we know that the companies controlling the debate are not interested in public transport. In a lot of cases are trying to crowd out public transport, which is a big concern. So I think we should be looking at questions of power in terms of who's doing the hyping, if that answers your concerns.
I'm curious, you had a quote about, is it 3 years or 3 years, or relates to both?
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious where you see this actually starting to materialize first. Are we going to see self-driving semis before we see self-driving cars? Will it be cabs and Ubers? Like where my guess is that sort of the car for the people will be last. But I'm curious if that's.
And I think that's probably sensible. I think if you take our sort of whole systems approach, you might think, well, where in the system might self-driving transport be the obvious place to start? And then you might look at easily controllable systems. In the same way as aeroplane autopilots work not just because of the control device within the aeroplane, but the control device in the airspace as well, right? Social control. And you see that, for example, did you hear this story about the self-driving truck driving the length of Colorado full of beer? Anyway, that was a thing towards the end of last year, which is an extremely easy thing for a truck to do, because a highway, once you get the thing onto the highway and set it going, it's a very easy system to understand. I think the peculiar thing with the Tesla is the advertisement, if you like, of the Tesla navigating those windy Californian roads in the mist, which is a terrible place to start. And seemingly with all of the ride-sharing guys developing in the urban environment, it seems peculiar that that's where you would start, because unless what you're trying to do is coerce cities into reshaping their infrastructure and saying, listen, we can do this, but we need to get all of you pedestrians off the roads. So, and in lots of cases you look at systems that have been self-driving for years. And in London we have a self-driving train system called the Docklands Light Railway that works because it's an entirely closed system. The sociologist of science Bruno Latour famously did a study of a system called Aramis in Paris, which was developed in the 1970s, and failed because it was hopeless. But the technology was extremely easy because the system was controlled. So I think it's there where you're going to see the developments. The weird thing is all the excitement about cities, because that's almost the worst possible situation in which to start. Yeah.
If you believe that the infrastructure is going to have to be so changed for this to happen, do you believe that the introduction of self-driving cars will have to be assisted through the government? Will the government have to invest a lot of money for this to happen? Do you think that they will?
Well, I think the first point is to imagine. So the first point I would make is to imagine a new role for the government. At the moment, governments, certainly in the US, are seeing themselves as willing laboratories. Right? They're saying, yes, come and test here, or here are the rules for the experiment. What they're not doing is seeing themselves as collaborators, and I think that is a mistake, because I think actually realizing the potential of these things means there is a possibility for genuinely renegotiating the relationship between innovators and governments in this social experiment. And that's, I think, what places like London have greater potential for doing, because there the likely route is through public transport rather than private transport. What was the end of your question? Sorry.
Do you see the government? Do you think that they will take responsibility and try to collaborate in this process?
Yeah, I mean, there was a report that just came out in the UK from the House of Lords Science Committee that said that governments really need to be activist, which is quite interesting, because the norm is just to say that government's role is to get out of the way. And I think this is one of those cases where, rather than a race to the bottom, who can have the fewest regulations. So, for example, when Uber got punished by the Californians for behaving badly, there's a surprise. Whoever it was, the governor of Arizona, or maybe the mayor of Phoenix, or whoever, said, come here. So there was that sort of race to the bottom. Come here because we don't have any rules and you can do whatever you like. And I think actually the interesting game to be played is to do with whether a strong governance regime will actually be seen as a source of public confidence, and therefore there may be the possibility of a race to the top. I hope that might just be wishful thinking.
Well, I both agree with you in terms of city infrastructure and the number of risk variabilities for injury starting at the city level.
Yeah.
It also seems like it's at that level where we experimented and have succeeded with, its own autonomous lanes for, subway systems, bike lanes, bus lanes, these, sort of add-ons to our transit systems or transit infrastructure that are for specific uses.
Yeah.
And so when I think about it, sometimes I'm like, well, maybe it would be its own, somehow, I don't know, I think about it in somehow its own zone.
Yeah.
You know, like the transition would happen in its own zone, and it would, because of the sort of history of introducing new ways of sharing the road, that maybe it isn't the worst, you know, introductory environment, because some of the sort of government assistance or collaboration in terms of creating the regulations and laws that are necessary, or the zoning or whatever it would be, are, you know, there's some history there that could be a little bit more elastic.
Yeah.
To provide for that.
And I think you're absolutely right that there's a good history of cities as laboratories, and that they can organise themselves in ways that other parts of nations aren't able to. And I think that's really interesting. What I think we haven't started talking about is exactly what you were saying, that in order for that to make sense, though, you're imagining separate spaces, not the shared chaotic spaces that are actually cities, right? And the story of self-driving as presented by the machine learning enthusiasts is, oh, just give me a city, throw anything at me, I can deal with it, right? If children, dogs, buses jump out in front of this car, it'll be fine, right? That's a very different vision from the vision of, okay, let's have a separate space that is just used for this autonomous vehicle, which is in effect like the Docklands Light Railway. Technologically, that's a rather boring challenge. So I think you will see that negotiation take place. My concern is that in over-claiming of that sort, in the sort of hubristic mode, that yes, this car can do anything, that it then makes demands on cities that, for example, say, self-driving, so if you're Uber, or if you're, let's say if you're Uber, you would say to a city, listen, self-driving cars are orders of magnitude safer than buses, therefore we demand that you take out your bus lanes in the buses and replace them with a ride-sharing system. Right? And that becomes privatisation by the back door. And it's undemocratic, and that's the sort of thing that I worry about.
We run up against the hour, but if folks have other questions,